Tonight, winter weather causing chaos across America.
My first two flights I had to cancel, and this is my third.
The latest on the massive snowstorm affecting millions in multiple states. And
although Washington is shut down due to the weather, lawmakers at the U.S. Capitol certify the election of Donald Trump just 4 years after a mob of his followers launched an attack on that very building.
And the final preparations in the funeral plans for former President Jimmy Carter. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
The first major winter storm of the year, delivering ice and snow to millions across the United States. Good evening and welcome, Faith Nation. From Washington, I'm John Jessup. Well, this winter weather event named Winter Storm Blair has slammed the nation's capital with much of the area under a winter storm advisory. Several inches of significant snow already on the ground, shutting down schools and federal offices. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Michelle London is in Washington, where she's been tracking how the weather has been impacting the events of the day. Michelle, how is it out there?
Well, John, here in the nation's capital, I want to show you just a powdery mix that's been falling steadily throughout the day. And I'm standing on the popular M Street, where it's usually bumper to bumper in traffic. Commuters up and down the street walking throughout the day to work. And as you can see, quiet. They must be heeding those winter advisory warnings. Now, several states are declaring emergencies impacting about 60 million people. Winter Storm Blair has brought with it many dangers, like blizzard warnings issued in at least 3 states, fierce winds blowing down tree limbs, and other debris that could leave millions across the country without power. Several tornadoes issuing shelter-in-place warnings, slippery sheets of ice on the interstates, with some trucks in Ohio caught at a standstill. The National Weather Service is urging drivers to stay off the roads unless there's an emergency.
And I'm out here trying to conquer this hill that the snow definitely has locked in. And my 4-wheel drive broke down, so I'm using a 2-wheel drive with chains. And hopefully I can get out today, and hopefully the plow comes tomorrow and gets us out so we can move on with the rest of the day.
And wishing that driver the best there here in Washington. Even with federal offices closed today, House Speaker Mike Johnson says the certification of the 2024 election will go forward. Meanwhile, Winter Storm Blair so far has canceled more than 1,300 flights, with more than 8,500 delays in and out of the U.S. Southwest Airlines has the most cancellations right now with nearly 300. And American Airlines closely following with nearly 200 flight cancellations. The airports in D.C. being the biggest because they're major hubs and they're getting hit the hardest. So if you are planning to travel soon, delays and cancellations are expected. You may want to check the information by the moment to make sure you're up to date. John?
Some good reminders there, Michelle, and also stay safe and warm. Well, lawmakers on Capitol Hill braved the snow and ice today to certify the November 2024 election results. The final step before President-elect Donald Trump officially is inaugurated to reclaim the White House later this month. Today's certification also marks the anniversary of the January 6 U.S. Capitol attack. 4 years ago today, then President Trump urged his supporters to march to the Capitol to protest the certification of Joe Biden's 2020 election victory. In a Washington Post op-ed, President Biden asked Americans to remember January 6 as a, quote, day when our democracy was put to the test and prevailed, and that democracy, even in America, is never guaranteed. Meanwhile, President-elect Trump has vowed to pardon some of the people who stormed the Capitol during his first hours in office. Well, with us now is Nathan Gonzalez, editor and publisher of Inside Elections and a Faith Nation contributor. Welcome to you, Nathan, and Happy New Year. So this time around, the Electoral Count Reform Act is in effect to clarify the law and prevent what happened 4 years ago. Nathan, it was striking to see Vice President Kamala Harris presiding over the certification of her political opponent, Donald Trump. Can you talk about the significance of the day?
Yeah, it's significant because of of what happened 4 years ago. I think until 4 years ago, most people didn't even understand what the January 6th significance of that date every 4 years in our presidential process. But this is how it's supposed to be. This is that it's supposed to be. The certification takes place in the states, the ratification in Congress, and it's supposed to be smooth. And I think, unfortunately, I'm not sure that it going smooth this time says what it will be like in the future, because a key difference between this time and 4 years ago is that Trump won and that Republicans won. And when that is, at some point, Democrats are going to win again. And what will happen when that happens is still a key question.
Open for debate there. Nathan, in his op-ed, President Joe Biden wrote that while Americans should be proud that our, quote, democracy withstood the assault, that there's been a, quote, unrelenting effort to rewrite or even erase what happened on January 6, 2021, which I should also mention led to several deaths, both among the crowd and Capitol Hill police. While critics might say he's being partisan and retrudging the past, why do you think President Biden has written so forcefully about this?
Because he believes that it's important. I think that when we look to the future, we have to remember about January 6th that there really have been no electoral consequences for the individuals that the politicians that fueled what happened on January 6th of 2021. And there may not even be consequences for the citizens that participated in it if President Trump fulfills kind of what his promise is to pardon many of the January 6th folks when he gets into office in a couple of weeks. And so when people do things, when people have actions without consequences, then that could lead us to this happening again. So I think this op-ed points out that it's important, but we can't take it for granted that just because this one was smooth, that all future and subsequent transfers of power will be smooth as well.
Nathan, as you were just alluding to, President-elect Trump has vowed to pardon some of the hundreds of people who've been convicted for the January 6th Capitol attack or stand as defendants. A press conference is happening today calling for the release of all of the people that they describe as, quote, political prisoners. Meanwhile, an opinion piece in U.S. News and World Report said that the pardons would amount to whitewashing a criminal attack on our democracy. Nathan, in the few seconds we have left, how do you think history will look at these potential presidential pardons?
I hope that history will see January 6, 2021 as a stain on our country, something that we came very close to not having a peaceful transfer of power, which is a hallmark of our country. And so whether President Trump pardons folks or not, I hope that it does not diminish what happened and the severity of the violence that happened on January 6, 2021.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Nathan Gonzalez, editor and publisher of Inside Elections, thank you so much for your analysis.
Thanks, John.
Well, President Biden is in New Orleans tonight to visit those affected by the horrific truck ramming terrorist attack that killed 14 and injured dozens on New Year's Day. Meanwhile, the FBI has unveiled chilling new details about the timeline before the attack. Authorities say the suspect, Army veteran Shamsuddin Jabbar, visited New Orleans twice before plowing a truck into crowds on Bourbon Street. During one of those visits in October, police say he recorded the French Quarter using a Meta smart glasses rather. The FBI believes Jabbar was planning an even deadlier attack and say he planted homemade explosives on two separate streets. Fortunately, neither one detonated.
He didn't use the correct device to set it off, and that is just indicative of his inexperience.
Jabbar was killed in a shootout after the deadly crash. Officials say he was inspired by ISIS and believe he acted alone. Well, Tim Miller joins us now. He is a former Secret Service agent and the founder and president of Lionheart. Tim, welcome to you. So what's your reaction to this attack? Is there anything that stood out to you about the attacker's background or planning?
Yeah, I think this was a double tragedy. We had a horrific attack that killed or injured dozens of people, but it was by a U.S. military member. And it does raise the question of the radicalization. Here's a guy who had served very successfully in the military, but at some point, this extreme ideology twisted him, even to the point prior to this attack, he was talking about murdering his own family. And I think that should be a wake-up call for all of us. We've let millions of people come into the country, many of which we don't know who they are. And I think it's going to be a very interesting 2025. I think it'll be a violent year this year, because we know that when one of these attacks happen, we learned this in the Secret Service, there are hundreds in line to do the second, third, and fourth one.
Well, Tim, along those lines, you just indicated, what are the chances that bad actors may try to copy this kind of attack at major upcoming events like the Super Bowl or the inauguration?
Well, I think it's 100% that some are going to want to do it. The question is, can they? Remember that those events are called NSSE, National Special Security Events. They're going to have security on steroids. I'm more concerned for a mirror attack like we saw in New Orleans. Crowds of people just trying to enjoy themselves and, not expecting a horrific attack like this. Remember the simplicity of this: a vehicle, a weapon, and some homemade bombs. And if we don't think that there are a lot of folks like-minded that are watching, I think we're mistaken.
Tim, what kind of special challenges do lone wolf attackers pose compared to larger, more coordinated attacks by a group?
Yeah, that's a great question, John, because the reality is they create a very challenging investigative pathway, because if they're keeping things to themselves, if they're not connected to a network, if they're monitoring their communications, if they're learning solely off public Wi-Fi sources, it's difficult. And that, highlights the challenges that we're going to have. Because remember, we have exited the Syrian battlefield where a lot of folks were hurt and killed. We still have a very contentious, angry situation in Israel and Gaza. And a lot of folks blame America. So I think we should wisely anticipate, problems attacking in our own homeland.
Tim, just a few seconds left. Any advice for people who might be concerned about the rising threat level and how they can protect their families? They can't stay indoors at all times. Any advice that you might offer?
Yeah, best question of all, you have to assume your own security director role, meaning you don't just haphazardly go places. You're vigilant, you're alert, you're aware, you have an emergency plan, you think about what would I do if. Training is a great idea these days, everything from weapons training to self-defense, and we pray hard that God would protect us.
I think that last bit is excellent advice. Keep in prayer. Tim Miller with Lionheart, thank you so much for your time, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, John. Thanks for having me.
In other news, former President Jimmy Carter is making his final journey to the nation's capital. Over the weekend, people lined the streets as the procession carrying his casket passed by on its way to Atlanta, stopping for a moment at his family's farm in Plains, Georgia. Later arriving at the Carter Presidential Center for the first memorial service. Tomorrow, President Carter's remains will be flown to Washington, D.C., where he'll lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda until Thursday. Then he'll be moved to the National Cathedral for a memorial service and finally back home to Georgia for a private interment. Up next, a deadly terror attack and a breakthrough in hostage negotiations. An update on the Middle East when Faith Nation returns. Welcome back. The White House is urging a final push for a Gaza ceasefire and hostage deal before President Biden leaves office. Talks are underway, but it's unclear how close negotiators are to the finish line. According to Reuters, Hamas has cleared an Israeli list of 34 hostages who could be freed at the beginning of a truce. The names include men, women, children, and the elderly. Israel says it has not received any confirmation about whether the ones listed are still alive. Desperate families are asking for all 100 hostages to be returned.
We ask you, please don't let any hostage stay behind. Please make sure all hostages are coming back home.
Meanwhile, Israel says a Palestinian terrorist killed 3 people today in a shooting in the West Bank, also known as Biblical Judea and Samaria. Authorities are searching for the gunman. Well, Ukraine is stepping up the ante in Russia's Kursk region, renewing its counteroffensive operations there. The move comes ahead of a meeting in Germany this week with Ukrainian officials and other partner countries. President Volodymyr Zelensky says he plans to seek more air support.
Dozens of partner countries will participate, including those capable of boosting our defense, not only against missiles, but also against guided bombs and Russian aircraft. We'll be discussing this with them and working to persuade them. Lives need protection here and now in Ukraine, and air defense systems must be operational for this purpose.
Russian forces are downplaying Ukraine's renewed advances in Kursk, saying they've already been pushed back. Well, in other news, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced today he is stepping down after a decade in power. His resignation comes after rising discontent over his leadership and amid turmoil in his government.
I care deeply about Canadians. I care deeply about this country, and I will always be motivated by what is in the best interest of Canadians.
Trudeau will stay on as Prime Minister until the Liberal Party selects a new leader. No date has yet been set for nationwide elections to find a replacement. Coming up, who's funding anti-Semitism at American universities as colleges receive unreported hundreds of millions of dollars from foreign countries? CBN follows the money trail after this. Welcome back. American universities receive hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign donations. Much of that goes unreported, a violation of federal regulations. The funds aren't just gifts. They often aim to influence decisions and attitudes at these schools, especially when it comes to Israel. CBN's Gary Lane reports.
For more than a century, the American Association of College Professors stood out as a defender of academic freedom by resisting boycotts. Last summer, however, the group shifted that approach, stating the association would support academic boycotts. Campus Reform's Ken Tashi believes this move is connected to anti-Semitism.
It's no coincidence that they changed their view and perspective on this issue soon after the terrorist attacks on Israel by Hamas terrorists. It's also no coincidence that their new position now aligns themselves with the campus protesters and the protests that we saw rage across campuses last spring.
An academic boycott occurs when an educational institution or organization refuses to engage with other colleges and universities because of institutional or governmental policies they find disagreeable. The AACP defended its policy shifts, stating, quote, "Academic boycotts are not in themselves violations of academic freedom and can instead be legitimate tactical responses to conditions that are fundamentally incompatible with the mission of higher education."
Well, frankly, in any other country. So the question becomes, why now? And I think the answer is because it is an effort to further that anti-Israel sentiment. It also aligns them now with the views of the BDS movement, the boycott, sanction, and divestment movement that has been called for across the country by a variety of organizations, including Students for the Justice in Palestine.
The BDS movement promotes academic boycotts of Israeli universities, accusing them of being, quote, "major, willing, and persistent accomplices in Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid." Last spring, a college professor in Pennsylvania was fired, while other universities investigated and suspended professors for pro-Hamas and anti-Israel activism. Their advocacy in and out of the classroom raised new concerns about foreign funding of universities and overseas influence on American academia. Neetu Arnold is a Paulson policy analyst and researcher at the Manhattan Institute.
I found that universities had failed to report $1 billion in foreign money, and much of the misreporting was from countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, primarily countries that are authoritarian.
And that are traditionally anti-Israel. Section 117 of the Higher Education Act requires universities to report foreign funds with a monetary value of $250,000 or more within a calendar year. Over the 2 terms of the Obama presidency, Arnold discovered that only $1.8 billion of the $3.9 billion available was reported, which means that 54% went unreported. During the Biden administration, 39% of $3 billion in reportable donations went unreported. Texas A&M is currently among the universities that Arnold claims have violated the law by underreporting foreign donations that exceed $250,000.
During the Trump administration, the university was in compliance. They were reporting their foreign funds. And then after the Trump administration left, I looked at their reporting for Chinese contracts, and it turned out that they just weren't reporting any of them.
Last January, Texas A&M President Mark A. Walsh III released a statement saying, quote, Texas A&M complies with all U.S. laws and agency regulations that govern how we manage and report international engagements. Additionally, Arnold maintains the origins of these foreign donations can be unclear. For example, ByteDance, the Chinese parent company of TikTok, makes donations that would not be identified as coming from communist China. Arnold discovered that the University of South Dakota reported a 2021 gift from ByteDance, which is incorporated in the Cayman Islands. She notes that because the company is not based in China, the university incorrectly assumed the donation freed China from potential influence.
I think it's so important to know who is donating to our universities and the purpose, whether it's going for cancer research or is it going to influence our curriculum.
Or seeking to buy influence through support of Chinese Confucius centers or Middle East studies departments. In terms of a potential solution, Arnold believes the incoming Trump administration must prioritize the investigation and enforcement of universities that violate the law.
And again, I think that's why it's so important that we have transparency, that there is enforcement, and that we're actually aware of these transactions in a timely manner.
Knowledge that can expose and prevent foreign influence that often stokes hate, violence, and anti-Semitism on American college campuses. Gary Lane, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Gary. Coming up, a snow day tradition in the nation's capital. Next on Faith Nation. Finally tonight, as snow returns to Washington, D.C., so does this district tradition. The first snowfall of 2025 brings up to an expected half a foot of snow in parts of D.C. just in time for the beloved annual snowball fight. This year dubbed the Great Meridian Chill Battle of 2025. Hundreds, as you can see, of people gathered at Meridian Hill Park this morning, wearing their winter weather gear and snowball making gloves. This battle is organized by the DC Snowball Fight Association and marks the 15th annual anniversary of the event and the organization's attempt to snowballize the masses. Looks like a lot of fun. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Have a great night.